one of the most talked about subjects today in the field of human resource management. All of you are aware that this is not a subject which is new to the field of HR. It's been there for the last 4 decades, ever since McClellan spoke about this concept in 1973. There are a lot of people who have researched, who have studied, and also defined what competencies are. So let us look at few fundamentals which are to be followed before you actually start getting into implementing this concept of competency-based management. Let's not jump into it just because many other organizations are following this practice and you're not one among them. So as a HR practitioner, it's important that you sit with the business leaders, understand what they really want from this particular initiative and why they feel that competency management could help them take the business to the next level. Now, I have come across business leaders articulating it very clearly that they would want to see these initiatives being successful just to see that many future leaders emerge in the organization, or employees are given the opportunities to understand what their strengths and weaknesses are, and employees are also given the opportunity to work on their competencies in order for them to see growth in the organization. The second step that you need to follow is to define the competency model and framework. Now, so what is competency framework? Now, how do you reach out to an employee communicating them that this is the competency framework of our organization and this is where we want all of you to work on and develop? So there requires some kind of a picturization, some kind of a visual representation of what your competency model is all about, and that's what we call it as competency framework. Now, in Career Tree, we recommend to most organizations to follow the model, which comprises of 3 competency clusters. The first one is fundamental competencies. The second one, behavioral or leadership competencies. The third one is about technical or functional competencies. There are people who have defined the competencies in different nomenclatures. For example, the technical competencies are also called as occupational competencies. The behavioral competencies are also called as managerial competencies, professional competencies. The fundamental competencies are also called as core competencies, organizational competencies. So just a change in nomenclature. The third step is about mapping competencies. So to quickly look at what do we mean by mapping competencies, we talked about the 3 different clusters of competencies. One is the fundamental competencies. If you consider this as a house of competency, everyone in the organization is required to possess the fundamental competencies. There are people who handle leadership roles, leadership responsibility. Such roles required to have leadership competencies. And the last one is about having functional competencies. Now, how do we map what competencies are required for whom? So as I said, the fundamental competencies are quite common to all in the organization. So we need to identify 2 or 3 critical competencies that you would like every employee in your organization to possess. They could be teamwork, innovation, customer orientation, which fundamentally emanates from the values and the philosophy of the organization. And that's why I say that this applies for all in the organization, irrespective of the roles and irrespective of the position that they handle. The second is about leadership competencies. Now, one methodology which is predominantly used for identifying leadership competencies is BEI. It stands for Behavioral Event Interview. One of the proven methodologies which is widely used by most professionals who are involved in this competency management practice. The common methodology which is applied for mapping functional or technical competencies is called as role analysis. It's also called as job analysis. We call it as role because any competencies that we are trying to map, they're all role based, and therefore we call it as role analysis. Now, so what could be the examples of leadership competencies? Coaching, innovation, the entrepreneurship, decision making, the risk taking. So there are many such which are part of the leadership competencies. What could be the example of functional competencies? Budgeting, production planning and management, networking, negotiation. So these are some of the competencies that would come as part of functional competency cluster. So essentially, if you put together all the 3 cluster of competencies for any individual, it should not go beyond 8 or 12 in number. The ideal number to keep is a maximum of 12 as competencies for any individual. So it's important to keep it manageable in terms of numbers. Only then you would see the end result. Only then you would see an appreciation from the employees. If there are people who are trained in mapping the competencies, that's a lot better in terms of arriving at a proper list of competencies. The next step is to create competency dictionaries for whatever competencies that have been identified in all the three different clusters. Let's look at how do we go ahead creating dictionaries, or what needs to be considered while creating dictionaries. The most important aspect is defining the rater scale. Now there are companies who use 3-point rater scale, 4-point rater scale, and 5 and 6 pointers also. In my experience, I have seen 4-point rater scale to be more objective, more easier in terms of helping employees understand what the competency requirements are, and also it helps the assessors in terms of arriving at the right proficiency level during the assessment. Number 2 is every dictionary that you create. So let's try and understand what is dictionary. Now the reason why we say every competency should have a dictionary is, let's say if I define a communication as one of the competencies, which is part of the leadership competency cluster. Now, when I define it, I am defining it with my understanding of what communication is all about. But if communication as a competency applies to someone who is a supervisor at the shop floor level, and also someone who is a general manager who is handling the entire works, and also somebody who is handling the business. So how do you define indicators, behavioral indicators that would take into consideration the various behaviors that you would expect all these three roles to demonstrate? So therefore the important aspect is that the dictionary means it's a common reference document for every employee in the organization to understand the competency in the same way as the project champion or the organization would want them to understand. Now, while you are defining the dictionary, there are three things that you need to keep in mind. The dictionary should reflect the knowledge element, skill element, and the attitude, or otherwise called as the behavioral element. Now, you won't be able to explicitly dissect and mention all these three in the dictionaries, but you would put it up in the form of behavioral indicators. Now, when you are putting this in the form of behavioral indicators, make sure that those indicators are relevant to the competency that you are defining, and they are measurable, and finally they are observable. The next step is deciding the assessment methodology. So we have identified and mapped all the competencies, fundamental, leadership, and technical competencies. We've also created the dictionaries. Now, so how do we go about doing assessment? Now, typically there are two methodologies which are followed across organizations. The first one is about assessment or development center. Why do we say assessment center? If the objective is only to assess employees and then to identify who among them fares well, and therefore you do a ranking and then decide whom to give the opportunity in terms of career progression, then you call it as an assessment center. Assessment center is also a methodology which is used during recruitment. When you want to select people and when you want to assess them on competencies before you select them, all the candidates who appear for the selection process, they take part in the simulation exercises, and the best among them would get selected. So one of the differentiating factor here is you don't necessarily give feedback to the participants there on how they fared on competencies. You would only decide whether they are selected or not selected, and that's why it's called assessment center. The second methodology is development center. If your objective is to help the employee understand where he or she stands on various competencies and thereby help them come out with individual development plan, the development center methodology becomes the relevant and the prominent one. In all these methodologies, whether it is assessment center or development center, simulation exercises are the base. Now, there is a third methodology which is often used when organizations have constraint with respect to availability of time and availability of resources in order to go ahead with assessment development center. When we say 360-degree, typically in most organizations we find employees are assessed with the feedback from their self, the peers, the subordinates and as well as the superiors. The superiors could be the direct and the upline. The subordinates are people who are directly reporting to them in their department. The peers are people who are either working in their department or people who are from the customer department, and then the self. Very rarely organizations go out of this boundary of these 4 stakeholders to take feedback from suppliers, vendors, customers, etc. So that's about 360-degree. The reason why I say 90-degree here is when it comes to functional or technical competencies, we generally don't encourage taking feedback from subordinates or taking feedback from peers, because functional and technical competencies are largely known to either the self or the upline or the direct superiors. So therefore we say the feedback is taken from the self and also from their upline or direct superiors. Having decided on the assessment methodology, the next step is to go ahead with conducting assessments. Now, so what are a few things that we need to look at while conducting assessments? Supposing if you're deciding to go ahead with Assessment Development Center methodology, make sure that you have the trained assessors in place. Either they are professionals or experts who are helping you from outside, or you have trained your own people who are good at assessing people. So there must be trained assessors in place. The second is you should have a lot of simulation exercises and tools created for the purpose of assessment. It could be in-basket exercise, case analysis and presentation, role plays, competency-based interviews, group simulations. Depending on the list of competencies and depending on whether you're observing them on behavioral competencies or fundamental competencies, you could decide on the list of simulation tools. However, 5 or 6 tools would essentially be required in order to arrive at a fair judgment about the person on various competencies. Now, where do you start and where do you end? Who should you consider for participation in the Assessment Development Center? Supposing if your organization is a small organization with about 50 to 100 member team, then it becomes easier for you to involve most all of them as part of the Assessment Development Center process. Supposing if your organization has employee strength of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, because in any assessment development center you can't go beyond the participant number 15 or 16. I am talking about the junior level. Now for a senior level, we don't encourage it to go beyond 8 or 12 in an assessment development center. So therefore you could either go ahead with doing the assessment development center only for the top leadership team or some of the critical positions at the middle and the junior level, or go ahead with those positions which are found to be extremely critical, where the future leaders are required, where the talent needs to be retained, which is essential for the business continuity. So you could decide based on such criteria. The most important aspect is make sure the report writing is done on time and the feedback is also given on time. The good assessment center or the development center, where after the assessment is done, the second day or the next day of the assessment, employees are given a very brief feedback in terms of how they have fared on various competencies. A detailed feedback with a report is given within a period of 15 days from the time the employees have completed their assessment process. Now let's look at 360-degree and 180-degree. Relatively, it is easier when it comes to administering it and then getting the feedback. But it cannot be used in all organizations, because if the employees are not matured enough to give the right feedback on various competencies, either for their peers or for their subordinate or for their superior, the value of such feedbacks is not really going to be helping the individual to work on his or her development. But the net outcome or the end objective should be to help the individual work on development and progress in his or her career. We have seen 6 steps of implementation so far. The first one is about the preparatory step. The second, third and the fourth are design phase. So this is where you actually design the competency model, the competency dictionaries, identifying competencies. All of this happens here. The fifth and the sixth steps is where you actually work on assessments, defining assessment methodology, creating tools, and then putting the assessment process in place, identifying the right kind of assessors, conducting the assessment center, or going ahead with 360-degree feedback methodology. All of this happens in the 6 steps. Now, the most important that we need to understand in any competency management initiative is, so far it's okay, but has it benefited the employee? Has it benefited the organization? It's not. So at the best, it can create an awareness among the employees in terms of what competencies would they be requiring to move up in their career. Beyond that, would it really push them to develop in their competencies? It's not. And therefore, the most important aspect is linking competencies to the other HR practices. Competency management should never be seen as a standalone practice. It's important that the competency dictionaries that are defined are used for recruitment. Now, BEI is one of the most popular methodologies and proven methodologies in assessing people on competencies at the time of selection and recruitment. You could also run a mini assessment center using the various competencies for a particular role and select the right kind of person. So straight away you could link it to recruitment practice. The second area where you could link competencies is employee development or training. When you are creating a training calendar at the beginning of the year, apart from taking the feedback during the annual appraisal process, you could also take the feedback that has come out of Assessment Development Center or a 360-degree feedback methodology and link it to the training needs. Beyond training, if your organization is keen on institutionalizing coaching interventions, sending employees for continuous education, encouraging people to go ahead with attending programs, conferences, reading various articles and materials, all these are part of employee development practice, which the best methodology is the 70-20-10 model, which is called the adult learning principle, which is used in any employee development, where competencies can straight away be linked. And the third and most important aspect is it's all okay, but what next for me is the question that an employee will ask. So from an employee point of view, career planning and career progression is one of the key questions that needs to be answered, for which the competency framework and the design work that has been done and the assessment that has been done would be of great help in answering to the questions on employees' questions on career progression. So you could straight away link it to career progression as well. Do not link the competency feedback or the ratings to deciding compensations. In order to become a role model and a trendsetter for others to follow you in this competency management practice, the important aspect is sustaining the practice. Like any other initiative, competency management also goes through a lot of tough weathers. And therefore, putting up certain systems in place in order to ensure continuous review and continuous thrust is very important. So some of the things that we suggest in Career Tree are, one is form a steering committee. Form a steering committee which would comprise of people from business leadership and also people from line leadership. Let them review the model regularly. Let them understand how relevant the model is with respect to the changing business context. And therefore, if there are any macro level changes which are required, they can suggest. The other important thing is to going ahead with forming a review committee. Review committee is little of a micro level management committee. They go into the details of the dictionaries, what kind of tools are supposed to be used, reliability of the assessors and the effectiveness of the assessors. So they do a micro reviewing of the entire aspect related to competency management. So that is very important. Now, having created the steering committee and review committee and made them function regularly, important is to also link it with PMS. Now, this is not something which is necessary to be done, but this is something that you could think through. If it suits your organization, you may want to do this. Now, in your PMS, when you put down the goals for employees, in an employee goal sheet, you could give some weightage for competency development and therefore bring that as one of the KRAs. In the goal sheet of the supervisor, you could bring in one of the goals as subordinate development or team members development and put certain weightages to it, apart from putting certain weightages for his or her own development. And that makes it mandatory, or that makes it compulsory for them to spend some quality time on their development. And of course, you would see the result if there's any change in behavior, if there's any improvement in their technical expertise. The last and the most important element to be looked at is take decisions based on competencies, provide opportunities based on competencies. Now you have your competency framework, you have a set of competencies, but if you are taking decisions on career progression without looking at the competency rating, then I'm sure employees will start losing the faith on this whole framework. So decisions related to employee career progression, role change, selection of employees, kind of development opportunities that you would want to provide to the employees, all of this, it's important that you take the competency rating into consideration and thereafter you make a decision. If you continue to do that, I'm sure over a period of time, as the initiative becomes practice at some point of time, the practice becomes habit at some point of time.